Well, welcome to our afternoon session at the Alaska Historical Society Convention. The topic this afternoon is Topics in Alaska History. We have four presenters, Shana Loshbaugh, Leanna Prax Williams, Philip Wight, and Tia Tidwell. In that order. The way we're going to run this is that, we have about 90 minutes, but 20 minutes each. I would like to have all the questions and answers reserved after everybody has presented their topics, and then we'll have some more free time that way. We'll start off with Shana Loshbaugh. Her talk is titled A Brief Awkward History of Fort Kenai. Shana came to Alaska in 1981. She told me she found it too interesting to leave. She divides her time between Kenai Peninsula and Fairbanks, where she has studied environmental history at the university system. And I also, in 2017, I thought I'd show everybody this, but she actually was the editor of this really important document, I think, that celebrated the 150th anniversary of the Alaska Purchase. I think it's a classic, and it's going to be on everybody's library for years. And so she did a bang-up job of putting that together at the Kenai College. So without further ado, Shana, you're on.
Okay, can everybody see my screen?
We can see you, but not your. You haven't shared your screen.
Sorry, I thought I had.
I don't think so. We don't see it. So there we go.
There we go.
Okay, now we're rolling.
We've got it. Great.
Okay. The Americanization of Alaska after the 1867 purchase did not always go smoothly. The unusual history of Fort Kenai is a case in point. This story traces the U.S. government's attempt to take over via Army troop deployments. On the Kenai Peninsula, this turned into quite the adventure. The transfer left U.S. officials scrambling. General Jefferson C. Davis, not to be confused with President of the Confederacy, went to Sitka to take command as de facto governor. Mobilizing a credible American presence throughout Alaska took much longer. Officials classified it as Indian country and set up interim military rule. Their context was demobilization in the wake of the Civil War and the Lower 48's ongoing Indian Wars. The U.S. Army would go north and monitor a largely unknown indigenous population. Because the official transfer took place so late in 1867, occupation beyond Sitka was deferred. The Military Division of the Pacific was based in California under Major General H.W. Halleck. The general planned 6 forts at Russian colonial trade centers at Sitka, Wrangell, Tongass, Kodiak, the Pribilof Islands, and Kenai. In March, the following March, the Army established the Department of Alaska, and servicemen shipped out of San Francisco that summer. Their lack of enthusiasm was summed up by General John C. Tidwell, later sent to Kodiak to oversee the forts. He wrote to a relative, quote, "It was a sorry day for my regiment when the purchase of Alaska was made, and I wish that Seward had all the icebergs and rocks and some of the polar bears rumbling around in his old dyspeptic stomach," unquote. 2 companies of the 2nd Artillery sailed for South Central Alaska. The first, Battery G, arrived safely in Kodiak and began constructing facilities. The other group, Battery F, under 37-year-old Brevet Captain John J. McGilvery, left Puget Sound on June 11, 1868. F's chartered ship, the Torrent, entered Cook Inlet on July 8th. Helmed by Captain Richard Carleton, she carried about 150. McGilvery, his men, 2 servants, 4 women, apparently all soldiers' wives listed as laundresses, and 11 children, plus 15 sailors. Also aboard were mules and other livestock, plus armaments, tools, and provisions. 3 eyewitness accounts describe what ensued. These are McGilvery's official reports to military authorities, an 1872 magazine article that the battalion's medical officer at the time, W.T. Wight, wrote, and private papers of Lieutenant Medorm Crawford Jr., fresh out of West Point. These men had only the vaguest notion of where the Russians' Kenai trading post was. Russians called the entire peninsula Kenai and the water west of it Kenai Gulf. Every place in the watershed was Kenai in the broadest sense. Moreover, when General Halleck gave orders to Davis, he used the name Chugachnik Gulf for Cook Inlet, a term Alaskans instead used for what we now call Kachemak Bay. Turning into Lower Cook Inlet, Captains Carleton and McGilvery bore northeast into Kachemak Bay, which they called Kenai Harbor. For several days, the ship scouted for landing sites along the relatively flat north shore. The first day, it promptly ran aground by the Homer Spit. The men dragged the Torrent into deeper water, anchored, and returned to reconnoiter the spit. Admiring the view and feasting on a big king crab, their first impression was hopeful. McGilvery rejected the Homer Spit as a fort site, however, because it lacked both fresh water and timber, plus he worried that high tides would inundate it. The next day, the crew moved the ship into the sheltered upper bay. A longboat rowed up the north shore to scout out the terrain. The men returned, saying they couldn't get within a mile of the beach. Another party was sent, waded ashore through the shallows, picked up coal samples, but couldn't climb the high bluff. McGilvery dug into the ground and found traces of permafrost. Wight wrote, "From the deck of the ship, Kenai appeared indeed like a paradise, but, as a soldier remarked, while dripping wet, as he stumbled through the swamp, holding his musket in one hand while he fought mosquitoes with the other, I tell you, boys, this is hell." The officers and Captain Carleton agreed to return to the southern tip of the peninsula. The chart showed a decent anchorage, known as English Bay or Port Graham. On July 12th, they headed that way. They fought stormy weather and extreme tidal currents. Adding to the stress, the skipper got ripping drunk. It took 3 days to get there. Early on July 15th, the mariners tried to thread the bark through the rocky entrance of Port Graham to the sheltered bight of Coal Cove. Carleton, apparently hungover, left the mate to steer. As currents and wind pushed the ship toward the outcrop the Russians called Dangerous Cape, the mate ran below to rouse the captain, who declared conditions unfavorable and ordered his crew to turn the vessel. But it was too late. Wight described the scene. Quote, "The yards were hauled, but the ship did not answer to the helm, and we saw that she was doomed. In 2 minutes after the order to tack was given, she struck the end of the reef, stern first, and swinging round, a wave carried her bodily upon the rock, knocking a large hole in her bottom. In a moment, everything was in confusion. The captain's orders were not obeyed. Soldiers and sailors ran about the deck in great excitement. The sails remained set, and the ship rolled fearfully in the white foam of the breakers, striking alternately on the bow and stern. Every time the ship struck the rock, dozens of men would fall and be carried across the deck. To add to the confusion, the great spanker boom broke loose and thrashed about the quarterdeck at every roll the ship made. It was soon evident that the ship was sinking, and the waves began to break over her amidships. The soldiers made a rush for the lifeboat, which was hanging at the davits, and in a moment it was full of men. Captain McGilvery and his officers threatened to shoot into the crowd if they did not come out. They obeyed very quickly, and with this exception behaved well. We had a large lifeboat, 2 ship's boats, and a small yawl, besides 2 large lighters, which were lashed to the forward deck. The boats were lowered, the women and children placed in the lifeboat first, and then ordered ashore with as many men as they would hold. In about 10 minutes after striking, the bark went down, but fortunately did not slide off the rock, unquote. It took a couple terrifying hours to row everyone about a mile to the Cove's beach. All the people and 5 mules survived. The Torrent was the first ship to sink in Alaskan waters since the U.S. acquired the territory. The soggy survivors huddled on the beach. The sailors rowed back out to collect everything they could reach, bobbing on the surface. During the next low tides, they went back to the wreck, salvaging a smattering of weapons and supplies. The castaways discovered they were not in a trackless wilderness. Above the beach were ramshackle buildings, remnants of the coal miners' outpost abandoned a few years earlier. In its heyday, about 1860, Coal Village had been large. Most roofs had collapsed, but the unwilling visitors bivouacked where they could. The officers worried about food, clothing, and how to get rescued. People had only the clothes on their back, rancor each day, and had to share blankets. Fear of attack from local Indians heightened the tension. A settlement was visible across the water, and no doubt the people would soon discover that the Torrent's passengers were essentially defenseless. The day after the wreck, McGillivray sent Lieutenant Gifford and sailors to row a lifeboat to Kodiak for help. 2 days later, the men returned, exhausted and discouraged. They'd gotten lost, and the boat leaked. The officers came up with a desperate bluff to deter attack. With enough dry gunpowder to shoot a salvaged cannon once, they fired it to falsely signal area natives that they could defend themselves. Crawford, in a 1905 interview, described the surprising result. Instead of fleeing, the natives ran down the beach, hopped in their bidarkas, and paddled towards Coal Cove. The officers ordered people to hide in the bushes, arm themselves with bricks and sticks, and not let natives see that they were unarmed. McGillivray and Crawford, with the only working pistols, stood on the beach to face the flotilla. As told in the newspaper, quote, "When the canoes reached about 50 feet from the shore, they drew up in battle line, and the one in the middle, containing the chief, left them and headed for the shore. He was met by Captain McGillivray and Colonel Crawford, and through a Russian soldier with the expedition, they managed to elicit from the Indian the fact that the Russians, who formerly had occupied the island, whenever they wanted assistance from the Indians, fired a shot, and they came immediately. When this fact became known, and that the Indians came for no hostile purpose, the officers felt very cheap, but thanked their stars that nothing more serious resulted from the visit of the Indians. Immediately, they arranged to buy food and services from the locals. McGillivray paid Sugpiaq kayakers $100 in gold coins to hurry to Kodiak with news of their plight. Crawford scrawled a note shown here. It began, quote, "We ran on a rock in trying to get into this harbor on the 15th last and lost everything we had except our lives," unquote. The kayakers proved true to their word. On July 29, they reappeared, bringing a letter and white trader from Kodiak. 2 ships were coming to rescue the group. On August 1st, the castaways were on the way to Kodiak. Once there, McGillivray filed reports on the fiasco, and Battery F spent a dreary winter of short rations and tight quarters as men and families doubled up with colleagues. At this juncture, I need to say more about Crawford. After the wreck, he becomes our main source. At Kenai, he kept a journal, wrote family letters, and worked his way up. We don't have photos of him as a young man, but he had a long and distinguished Army career, and his descendants donated his Alaska papers to the UAF archives. In the spring, Battery F shipped north into Cook Inlet again, with better directions. Sailing with them was General Tidwell. They bypassed the southern peninsula altogether, arrived at the Kootenai River mouth, and on April 17, 1869, officially established Fort Kenai on the same site as the Russians' Fort St. Nicholas. Lacking a map of Fort Kenai, here's a later picture. Circled on the left is the landmark chapel, said to be where the first Orthodox church stood at the corner of Fort St. Nicholas. By inference, it pegs the site of Fort Kenai. The soldiers had to wait for high tide to get boats into the river mouth, then carry all items up the steep and eroding trail, angling up the face of the bluff to the plateau above. The Russian ruins there immediately created a housing crisis. Battery F's men set down their arms and picked up building tools. The newcomers found a substantial settlement. Local influencers included Kenaitse families, the Russian Orthodox Church, and fur trading posts. West Coast entrepreneurs had reached Alaska faster than government representatives and inked deals with the Russian American Company. Already, Hutchison Coal and Company, forerunner of the Alaska Commercial Company, was established in hub communities. Running Kenai's trading post were Vladimir Stafieff, a multilingual holdover from the Russian American Company, and James Wilson, a Scotsman the new owners brought in to deal with English speakers. Relations between the military and mercantile posts were ambivalent. Crawford's younger brother, Fred, came up from Oregon and got a job as a trading post clerk that summer. Yet, military records complain that the trading post entrepreneurs had seized the good buildings and left the dregs for the Army. General George P. Eyre visited Fort Kenai in September to inspect facilities and wrote, "The best of the late Russian buildings are claimed and occupied by Hutchison Coal and Company. There has been barefaced swindling, sufficient in connection with the transfer of the buildings to make a saint swear. The long and short of the business is, the agent of the Russian Fur Company disposed of the best of the warehouses and residences to HK and Company and to private individuals for a mere song, and then turned over to the agent of the United States the balance, which, with very few exceptions, for appearance sake, are fit for firewood only. Ugh." Alaskan sources say little about life at the fort. Instead of military action, soldiers faced unpleasant food, weather, housing, tedium, and personality clashes. Who were these men? One private's name leaps out for Alaska history buffs: Ivan Petrov, listed as a clerk and translator. It appears that other soldiers were, like Petrov, European immigrants. Lieutenant Emilius de Mulin was born in Italy. The roster includes Germanic and Irish names. Ages vary. Crawford was only 24 when he got to Alaska. McGilvery described one private as too elderly to work. Some men had families along. Corporal Patrick Ford brought his wife, Celia, and their 3 children, who all experienced the shipwreck. A 4th, baby Mary, was born at Kodiak. 3 lieutenants assisted McGilvery. Gifford was treasurer and post adjutant. DeMullen was a draftsman and second in line to serve as adjutant. Crawford was quartermaster and ran the commissary. Dr. Achuff, who replaced wife, ran a so-called hospital. Outreach to locals was a priority. During the first week, Gifford and Crawford hiked over to Skituk, later called Kenai Village, which Crawford described as squalid. In May, the 2 officers visited Ninilchik, and later in the summer, McGilvery sent DeMullen north to seek meadowland and interview people near Nikiski. At the end of July, the fort hosted its first important visitors. Major General George H. Thomas, nicknamed the Rock of Chickamauga during the Civil War, had replaced Halleck and was on inspection tour. In October, Davis and Eyre, mentioned earlier, visited. The generals praised the Kenai Peninsula's scenery, mild weather, and big salmon, but they deemed the fort a useless mess. Alcohol and personality clashes were part of the mess. Only 10 days after the fort's founding, Crawford journaled about the unbearable Lieutenant DeMullen. The artistic Italian had a drinking problem. A month later, Crawford wrote, DeMullen got very tight last night with the priest and got him into bed in his DM's bed, and then went to the priest's house and tried to go to bed with his wife, but was hammered nearly to death with a rolling pin and finally slept in a cow house, at least so everyone says, and he has his head pretty badly mashed up today. Problems with DeMullen reached a dramatic crescendo in November. DeMullen went on a drunken spree. Captain McGilvery arrested him, but he escaped, retired to his quarters, and was quiet for a while. Then, about midnight, DeMullen appeared in Dr. Achuff's room and tried to shoot the sleeping man in the head at close range. Achuff fled. There was a bullet hole in his pillow and another in his door. DeMullen was secured and shipped off to Kodiak for court-martial. By the start of 1870, it was clear the fort was failing. Battery F saw attrition, turnover, and absences. Men, including Lieutenant Gifford, were transferred to Kodiak. McGilvery developed health problems, and in April, he left for California. By default, Crawford became commander of the dwindling garrison. He predicted the fort's imminent closure and called it the most useless of any post, probably, in the civilized world. In August, Secretary of War William W. Belknap ordered all Alaska posts closed except Sitka. Stafieff penned a scathing letter about the garrison. He described the soldiers as careless arsonists debauching the locals. Our Fort Kenai is to be done away with, he wrote in Russian to a friend. They are now evacuating half the soldiers, and the remaining half will be moved out in September or October. Then, praise be, life will be peaceful. Crawford executed the demobilization. Control of buildings and other assets would go to Wilson for safekeeping, and goods they couldn't transfer would go free to friendly Indians in the vicinity. On September 14, 1870, Crawford turned the facility over to Wilson and left. Fort Kenai had existed for 17 months. Fort Kenai's main impact was renaming the hamlet. Known as Fort St. Nicholas or Nikolaevsk during the Russian period, the village began appearing on English language maps as Kenai. The Kenai name also attached to the adjacent river, earlier called by the Dena'ina Kaknu or Kotnu. When the military fortified Alaska on the eve of World War II, it named a small artillery post at Kane's Head near Seward, Fort McGilvery. And in 1867, for Alaska's centennial, Kenai won a grant to rebuild Old Fort Kenai, a log structure used for years as a museum and community center. The most exciting Fort Kenai news in recent decades was the rediscovery of the sunken Torrent in 2006. Perhaps the most significant artifact for science and history was the ship's head, the first documented flush toilet in Alaska. The end.
Thank you, Shana. Oh, God. Very impressive. Like I said, we'll wait till the end for questions and answers. Our next speaker is Leanna Prax Williams. Leanna obtained a bachelor's degree in mass communication from Linfield College, a master's degree in Northern Studies from the University of Alaska. She was the winner of the Kleinfield for outstanding master's students in Arctic and Northern Studies. She has many interests. She's actually pursuing a PhD now in Arctic and Northern Studies. She had many interests, but include many focuses on aviation in Alaska, mass media, American mass media included. What we're going to hear today, though, is about Missing from the Northern Sky, an analysis of newspaper coverage of the Merrill and Eielson searches in 1929 and 1930, which were historically very important. I look forward to hearing this presentation, Leanna. Thank you. You're on.
All right, and we got to share screen. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. As Tom mentioned, I'm here to talk about the searches for Russ Merrill and Ben Eielson. Why this topic? I'll give you my background. When I was in my 20s, I worked in flight operations in the airline industry here in Fairbanks. So when Ted Stevens' death in a plane crash and the rise of reality television programs about Alaska brought the industry back into the spotlight, I was struck by how often early pilots were talked about as heroes and cowboys. I wanted to know why. So these questions actually led me to my master's thesis, which was an analysis of newspaper coverage of early Alaska aviation. And today I'm going to be talking about 2 of the 6 case studies that composed my thesis research. In this paper, I will be detailing the search for Anchorage aviator Russ Merrill and the search and recovery of Ben Eielson and Earl Borland. So I want to know, what did newspaper reports convey about the lives and deaths of Alaska aviators and the relationship to Alaska and the frontier? And how has the portrayal of these early Alaska pilots in ways that perpetuated frontier mythology affected attitudes towards Alaska's aviation industry? So for my definition of frontier, I'm using Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, which argued that the westward expansion experience of the United States formed a national identity distinct from Europe and formed the country's character. This article examines newspaper coverage of the Merrill and Eielson searches, finding that newspaper media framed the incidents in a heroic frontier narrative, thereby building the image of the pilot as a pioneer in a new aerial frontier. And, this paper makes an original contribution by parsing the language of media accounts to show that the themes surrounding Alaska aviation and frontier developed in the public mind. In it, and I compare and contrast the coverage of these 2 searches and finding that in both cases, the content and tone of the reporting contributed to this growth of the image of the pilot as a frontier hero. So why newspapers? Well, they were the dominant news medium of the time. And from a research standpoint, they are all accessible easily today, whether it's online, on online archive or microfilm at Rasmussen Library. So for each article relating to one of these incidents, I did qualitative content analysis of tone and vocabulary used in the articles. Which brings me to the case studies. I'm gonna just run you through them in chronological order, talk about some details from both, and then wrap up with my comparison and conclusions. Russ Merrill. The first case study concerns Russ Merrill, early pilot who's one of the first in Anchorage. He had been flying in Alaska for about 4 years at the time of his death. You might recognize that name as Merrill Field if you're down there in Anchorage. On September 16th, 1929, Russ Merrill takes off from Anchorage in a Travel Air float plane, seen on the bottom of the screen here, headed for Nyack Mine in Western Alaska. He never got there and never returned to Anchorage. Delays were relatively common at this time, so there was initially very little concern about his absence, but eventually searchers did begin to look for him by airplane and by boat around Cook Inlet. There were a few clues, including the sighting of something seen from the village of Tyonek out in Cook Inlet. Then in late October, more than a month after his disappearance, a Tyonek fisherman brought a scrap of fabric he'd found on the beach to Merrill's company in Anchorage for identification. It was confirmed that it was from the plane. So searchers concluded that Merrill had likely crashed into Cook Inlet soon after takeoff, either due to a mechanical problem or possibly weather, possibly his freight shifting in flight. In analyzing this newspaper coverage, I identified 49 articles about the search, first covering a date range from September 16th, the day he took off, to November 25th, when the Seattle Times Aviation column mentioned a shortage of experienced pilots in Alaska that was exacerbated by the search for Eielson, or for Merrill and Eielson. At the time of his disappearance, stories about aviation were very common in the newspaper, appearing almost daily, whether it was something local or something about Charles Lindbergh. Aviation was very much in the public mind. And Alaska newspapers covered this search with the most interest, but it did earn some mention in other newspapers around the country, including Seattle Times, although not in the New York Times. And that brings me to our second case study, the search for Ben Eielson and Earl Borland. Ben Eielson is often considered the father of Alaska aviation. Some might say that's debatable, but he did organize and fly the first airmail flights in the territory and was known around the world for his polar flights with Sir Hubert Wilkins. For this search, I identified 631 separate articles ranging from November 15th to March 29th, which detailed the coverage of Eielson's funeral in North Dakota. So basic chronology. Autumn 1929, Eielson's company, Alaska Airways, which was owned by an outside company called Avco, secured a contract to haul fur and passengers from the trading ship Nanook, which was icebound north of Siberia across the Bering Strait. The contract was for $50,000, which would be about $740,000 in 2019 currency. Eielson and another pilot had made one successful trip and had returned to Teller. But then on November 9th, Eielson and his mechanic Earl Borland take off from Teller to do a second trip and flew off into bad weather and never made it to the Nanook and never returned to Teller. As with Merrill, there was initially little worry, but when the weather improved and Eielson and Borland did not arrive either at the Nanook or in Teller, a search was launched using both airplanes and dog teams. There was extensive mechanical and weather delays for the searchers, compounded by the lack of daylight. The crash site was eventually discovered in late January, the day after the sun came back up over the horizon, by Joe Crossan and Harold Gillum. But then it took more than a month to locate the bodies and return them to the United States for burial. In this case study, I found that radio, specifically ground-based radio telegraphy at Nome, Teller, and on the Nanook, played an important role both in conducting the search and in reporting on it, which was a distinction from the Merrill search just a few months before. The newspaper reporters were very conscious of this technology's influence and included it in their reports. In one such example, the Fairbanks Daily News miner wrote, "Through the air of the same course over which he had so often flown, and down the same channels in which in days gone by have been carried the tidings of his triumphant returns, the radio flashed last night the news of the finding of the body of Ben Eielson." So what did I find in this case study? What did they tell us? Well, as I was doing this research, one passage that especially struck me as encapsulating the challenge facing Alaska aviation history comes from historian Stephen Haycox, who wrote, "The beginnings of aviation in Alaska have been described with such affection that it is often difficult to separate the reality of events from the aura of myth and romance that has come to surround them in the public mind." What do we see about frontier themes in here? Because the myth and romance certainly shows through in these accounts. We find that the image of the pilot as a frontiersman originated outside and was imported to Alaska, like so many other things. This image shown here on the screen, entitled "Using All Her Colors," is discussing a crash in New Mexico that actually occurred just before the announcement of Merrill's disappearance. In it, we can see some Wild West imagery and highly dramatic language. We see Wild West territory, Indians on the trail, thrills, human interest, brotherly love, sacrifice, tragedy, all these great dramatic stories, or elements to the story there on Fate's canvas. In both cases illustrate an overwhelmingly European American settler perspective on these incidents, even though indigenous populations were critical parties to both the search and the primary inhabitants of the region in which the Merrill and Eielson and Borland disappeared. The minimization of the Dena'ina, Athabascan, and Chukchi assistance in the searches replicates this colonist-oriented narrative that is so prevalent in Alaska and American frontier history and literature. In here, we see that there are two conceptions of frontier present in Alaska. Newspapers discussed both Alaska's terrain as frontier and the sky as frontier. And Alaskans, specifically those living in towns big enough to have newspapers, often viewed themselves as pioneers as well. Newspapers repeatedly stress the importance of these frontier-associated values for survival. The importance of these values for survival for these aviators, and emphasize the characteristics and qualities as they held up these pilots as heroes. These might include resourcefulness, bravery, acceptance of risk, self-sufficiency, sacrifice, rejection of physical comforts, and rebelliousness. One theme the newspapers presented throughout is the optimism in the pilot's ability to survive, often for long periods in cold weather after a crash. And the weather became a foil for emphasizing the skills and qualities I just mentioned, and showing just what the searchers and the missing men were up against, and help explain the lack of success in a rescue, as shown in this headline from the Eielson search: Arctic hunters are helpless in menacing fog. And the weather was tough. I sure wouldn't want to be searching for a missing plane above the Arctic Circle in a snowstorm in late December. And the weather really was an enemy in a lot of ways, an enemy to safe flight, but also to financial success. Pilots who didn't take a bold approach, like Noel Ween is an example, lived to survive, but didn't always make for good newspaper coverage. And revising or oversimplifying monetary interests to create a hero narrative was another theme that emerged. For example, during the Eielson search, early pieces discussing it often mention the contract, but then that changes over the course of time. November 15th, 1929, just less than a week after he disappeared. The Anchorage Times wrote, Eielson said the planes have 5 more trips to make and would leave today for a second air voyage over the Arctic Ocean. There was some time lag in getting that information from that he might have been missing. But later accounts emphasize that mercy mission and the self-sacrifice, with a March 14th poem in the Anchorage Daily Times proclaiming, "No braver deed can a man perform than going to the rescue of others in the face of an Arctic storm," in which mercy mission was emphasized, and it minimizes those economic considerations. And newspapers often ignored the fact that men collected paychecks for this work. So in conclusion, reportage on these 2 episodes suggested that the searches served an entertainment function for newspapers. Articles shared space with serialized fiction published daily. A daily update on an ongoing news story was not only a public service, but might also serve a role similar role to its fictional counterparts. It encouraged loyal news readership through ongoing investment in a single story. And the small group of Alaska pilots meant that readers would recognize names and be able to follow their careers over the course of time with growing investment. For example, Ben Eielson and Joe Crossan both featured in both of these case studies, and Crossan in others in my thesis research as well. Incorporating frontier themes into these stories provided a shorthand to readers already acquainted with the genre. These stories presented idealized portraits of the pilots, even when the facts of their death revealed serious flaws in their decision-making. Accounts often minimize these economic impetus behind Alaska aviation, instead framing their deaths as sacrifices during missions of mercy. So, newspaper portrayal of the early pilots suggested that pilots had to be bold and brave in order to succeed. Excitement sold newspapers, and sitting on the ground waiting for weather just didn't make for good copy. And that romanticized history became the accepted reality, as Haycock suggested. Colleen Mondor, an aviation journalist, had further agreed. She argued, the influence of the pioneer pilots cannot be denied or over-exaggerated, as they established the atmosphere in which all current professional pilots fly today in Alaska. But very little attention has been given to this characterization. Katie Ringsmith's Alaska Skyboys is the only monograph I was able to locate on the topic, and her research focused on the development of the pilot, the aviation industry, and the depiction of the pilot in the Wrangell-St. Elias region. David Courtwright more broadly examined the topic in his text, Sky as Frontier, but his was a general monograph. As such, more work could be done on the relationship between Alaska aviation, the news and entertainment media, and the depiction of the pilot as a frontier hero. So this trope of heroism lingers in Alaska. Long after technological developments, safety improvements, regulatory changes, and increased emphasis on safety in corporate culture have illustrated the desire to render the cowboy pilot a relic of the past. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. You're right on time, by the way. That's perfect. Again, we'll leave the questions and answers toward the end. So we'll move on to Philip Wight, who will be our next speaker. Philip is an assistant professor of history and Northern Studies at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He studies energy and environmental history with a focus on political economy, transportation infrastructure, social movements, and climate change in the North. So, and his topic today, the origins of anti-road movements in Alaska, 1960 to 1980. Philip, you're on. Okay. I'm off.
Philip, are you muted perhaps? Because we're not seeing you.
Where is Philip? There he is.
Well, no, he stopped sharing his screen, so.
Oh, he is. He's muted himself, I think.
Oh, no.
Does he hear us, I wonder? I can't do much.
Okay, Philip, can
I
you?
hear you a little bit muted. I wonder if you should turn your volume up, Philip? No.
He's muted.
He's not muted though.
Really?
Ask to unmute. We can't hear you.
Yeah, my screen shows he's muted though. Huh. Wonder what we do here.
He could log off and log back in.
It looks like he wants us to go back to him after he fixes his audio. I'd be happy to present ahead and give him a little bit of time to fix that.
Okay. Oh yeah, I see his message. Okay.
Shall we then go ahead with Tia Tidwell?
Sure.
Tia Tidwell is an assistant professor in the University of Alaska Fairbanks' Department of Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development. Originally from Anatuvik Pass, she is an enrolled member of the Nupamayu tribe and currently resides in Fairbanks. The topic is Christine Storm, the main character of Edna Ferber's Ice Palace. I'm very interested in this. I've always liked that movie, Ice Palace. I watch it from time to time, and it has an international audience. I mean, people from all over the world have actually watched that. So without further ado, Tia, you're on, I guess.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be part of the Alaska Historical Conference through the Professional Scholarship Award. I'm really grateful that I was able to receive that. Okay, so can you guys see my screen?
Yep, it's good.
Okay, great. And actually, I'm going to be focusing a lot more on the novel than I am the film. There we go. But you'll see some of the images in my slideshow are from the film. Okay, so the paper that I'll be presenting today is Apart and Anew, the Positive Logic of Settler Colonialism Constructing the Ice Palace. This research examines Edna Ferber's enormously popular pro-statehood novel, Ice Palace, and the novel is set in the fictional town of Baranof, which is modeled after Fairbanks and was released weeks before statehood was achieved in Alaska. The novel was eventually turned into a movie, and some of the images that you'll see are from the film. I draw upon research already done by Dr. Ross Cohen, J.E. Smythe, and Thomas Scatz that clearly outlines the relationship Ferber had with influential Alaskan figures such as Ernest Gruning and the political impact of Ferber's Ice Palace in the American imagination. The foundation has already been built to view the real-time effects the novel's release had on national and state politics, so my work specifically examines the main character, Christine Storm, and the way that Ferber uses her to create a foundational myth for the emergent settler state society of Alaska. I'm engaging with post-colonial frameworks to describe the settler colonial anxieties and processes at work in the text. Christine Storm is a dynamic part Eskimo granddaughter of two settler grandfathers, and she becomes a symbol of recuperated indigeneity, firmly incorporated into white American heteropatriarchy, even while Ferber's novel uses rhetorical methods to erase indigenous people's pathways into the future. And you'll see that I kind of am alternating between indigenous, Alaska Native, and Eskimo as the text that I'm interacting with call for. So set in the fictional town of Baranof, Ice Palace is named after the largest building in town, a 14-story high building made of glass. So Edna Ferber made several trips to Alaska while she was doing research for this novel. And the two towns that the novel takes place in, Baranof and Orgruck, are modeled after Fairbanks and Kotzebue. And you'll see down here, the Ice Palace, we think is modeled after the Northway building, which was the first building in Fairbanks with an elevator. So the action of the novel follows Christine's two grandfathers, resource mogul Czar Kennedy and the financially impoverished intelligentsia Thor Storm. The disagreements revolve around future paths for Christine. Is she married to a governor and educated out of state, or married to a half-native pilot and educated in all things Alaska? Alaskan Ice Palace's debut weeks before Alaska's statehood was addressed in Congress played an outsized role in Alaska's achievement of statehood. Ferber was a writer that both the populace and politicians paid attention to, and Smythe even notes that the Ice Palace shows up in congressional record. The pro-statehood angle of Ferber's Ice Palace and the national success of the book implicate Ferber in the subsequent granting of statehood. The timing of Ferber's novel and subsequent impact of the political environment is an excellent example of the way that literature can be more than a mere reflection of culture, but rather complicit in settler colonial structures. And the argument that I'm making here is that literature employs rhetorical structures that open space for physical and political action. Statehood becomes possible in part because Ferber discursively claims Alaska in the American imagination first. Although it's out of print now, Ice Palace was enormously popular during its time. The novel's central character, Christine Storm, had captured the attention and heart of Alaska and the national audience. Christine Storm is an enigmatic figure in the Ice Palace. She's described as quite beautiful. She has golden hair and bright black eyes, which is a nod to her Eskimo heritage. Ferber sets Christine up as a parallel metaphor for Alaska and then uses Christine's character to navigate the transition from indigenous to settler through a series of rhetorical methods widely used in settler colonial fantasies. Ferber's novel emphasizes the incorporation of indigeneity in the service of creating a settler colonial society that has a legitimate claim to Alaska. Christine has an autochthonous birth story, which we'll get to later, but she was magically born in a snowstorm and then placed into the gutted body of a caribou to survive the cold, which is magical. So Christine, with her autochthonous birth story, has an indisputable right to exist in Alaska, whereas the settler colonial society must grapple with their own lack of founding narrative. Ferber uses the literary trope of adoption to vicariously transfer legitimacy through kinship to Storm's two settler grandfathers, Czar Kennedy and Thor Storm. So the argument that I'm making here is that Ferber uses Christine as a founding symbol in much the same way that Pocahontas is viewed in American, foundational American narratives. And here are some pictures of Pocahontas. You'll see here, this is an early 19th century painting over here of Pocahontas, and you'll see that she's kind of mediating the path between indigenous and settler, and that she also has much lighter skin than her counterparts. Okay. Ice Palace opens on scenes of virility and fertility that teach the audience right away to see a connection between Alaska and Christine. And this is a description of Christine from the book. Visitors often mistook her as purely ornamental, like the scenery. Hidden in those fabulous peaks and creeks and torrents were copper and gold and uranium and platinum and cobalt and tin and tungsten and nickel and lead. In the tundra and flatlands, coal and oil. In the vast streams and inlets, millions of finned and furred creatures from salmon to seals and whales. But they were not for the casual passerby. Beneath Chris Storm's shining surface, too, there were hidden treasures of mind and heart and spirit. When Ferber states that Alaska's fabulous treasures are not for the casual passerby, she's for grounding access within John Locke's labor theory of value. These dual methods, kinship to autochthony via Christine's magical birth and access to legitimacy through labor, gives the settler colonial society two avenues to build their own identity apart and anew from whence they came. Ferber conflates Alaska with Christine and uses her upbringing by settler grandfathers to create belonging and new identity that is resolved with statehood. In Patrick Wolf's seminal article, Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native, he marks settler colonialism's dual structures. On one hand, the elimination of indigenous people to create terra nullius, and secondly, in its positive aspect, the logic of elimination marks a return whereby the native repressed continues to structure settler colonial society. It is both as complex social formation and as continuity through time that I term settler colonization as a structure rather than an event. And this research is focusing more on the positive logic of the structuring of settler colonial identity versus indigenous elimination. Okay, so Ferber utilizes Christine Storm as a dual symbol for both land and indigenous people. America has a tradition of using indigenous women to represent land. Here we go. This is a drawing probably from 1575. Philip Young analyzes Pocahontas as a symbol for Indian women in America and Pocahontas the mother of us all. Thus, we have sort of an American Ceres or Demeter or Gaia developed from Pocahontas, a fertility goddess, the mother of us all. We, by our descent from her, become a new race, innocent of European and all human origins, a race from the earth, as in ancient mythologies of other lands, but an earth that is made from her. Philip Young explores the way in which Pocahontas is taken up and conflated with land, and by virtue of descent from her, a new race can be born connected to a new land. When Ferber conflates the land in Alaska to Christine Storm, Christine becomes a Pocahontas figure in Alaska's founding myth. Ferber opens Ice Palace on scenes of fertility. She writes, every third woman you passed on Gold Street in Baranoff was young, pretty, and pregnant. The men, too, were young, virile, and pregnant with purpose. So Ferber is actively creating origin. Thor Storm, Christine's grandfather, describes Alaska as primordial. He says, but this is as it was when the world began. And he's kind of gesturing to Alaskan scenery when he says this. When it was just made, it is like being at the beginning of the world. The emphasis on fertility and the primordial nature of Alaska gives Ferber the ability to create a foundational myth for the settlers of a new state. So Rena Green follows the ambivalent space that Indian women take up in the American imagination in the Pocahontas Perplex, the image of Indian women in American culture. She explores symbols that existed prior to Pocahontas and how she provided a convenient figure for these ideas to congeal around. The powerfully symbolic Indian woman as queen and princess has been with us since 1575 when she appeared to stand in for the New World. Artists, explorers, writers, and political leaders found the Indian as they cast about for some symbol with which to identify this earthly, frightening, and beautiful paradise. Thus, the Indian woman began her symbolic, many-faceted life as a mother figure, exotic, powerful, dangerous, and beautiful, and as representative of American liberty and European classical virtue translated into New World terms. When Indian women, or in this case, Christine Storm, bridge the old and the new world, it marks the native repress that continues to structure settler colonial society. For as Wolfe articulates, settler colonialism destroys to replace. There are many strategies that Ferber uses to guide the audience into seeing Christine Storm as Indigenous and as a mother figure and metaphor for Alaska. When the audience first meets Christine, dramatically, she is dressed the part of native daughter. Christine's official greeting costume is a parka of fox and sealskin with Eskimo symbols and mucklucks. Ferber's use of the word costume is telling. Throughout the novel, Christine is able to pick up and put down her Indigenous identity as it is useful to her or the story. Ferber counteracts whatever may be artificial about the blonde Eskimo character by giving her an Atachthonist birth story. So this is from the novel. By some miracle, he shot and killed a caribou. He slit the caribou's belly and gutted it and put my mother inside it on the furs from the sled. It was blood warm for a little while and sheltered, and it kept her from freezing and me too. Christine's survival as a premature infant born inside a bloody caribou carcass in an Alaskan blizzard is magical. The magic associated with her birth gives Christine a legitimate claim to Alaska. And so Robert Garbert in Wight, Atachthony describes Atachthony borrowed from ancient Greece as meaning sprung from the land itself. Garbert's research is situated in Australian settler society, but the powers that Atachthonist connection to the land described here can be directly applied to Alaskan settler society and to Christine. So he writes, firstly, the inequalities and violence that accompany the foundation of the state are forgotten through a single unifying myth. Secondly, Atachthony eliminates the question, to whom does or did the land belong? Thus, Atachthony serves to provide a myth of doubly peaceful origins. Thirdly, Atachthony legitimizes a claim to territory through boundaries dictated by nature and not through a social contract or the arbitrariness of a treaty. So Christine's Atachthonist birth from the body of a caribou in a snowstorm marks her as Indigenous to Alaska. Throughout the novel, Ferber uses the capitalized outside to clearly denote who does not belong, which implicitly marks those in Alaska as inside, sidestepping the question of belonging. Though Thor, Sar, and Birdie come to Alaska from elsewhere, they are marked as inside against the imagined outside and given a legitimate see-through kinship to Christine because of her magical birth, which has been dictated by nature. Garbett describes citizenship in settler societies as linked processes of the aboriginalization of Aboriginal minorities, the ethnification of immigrant minorities, and the indigenization of settler majorities. Ferber organizes the population of Alaska similarly in the Ice Palace. Christine is to be viewed as Indigenous in the mind of the audience, but her indigenization is different than the aboriginalization of the Alaska natives. Ferber does this by treating Alaska natives as relics that are not meant to survive into modernity. So here's a passage from the novel where Christine is traveling to Orkuk, which is modeled after Kotzebue. And they meet an Alaska native woman named Mrs. Rasky. One simply did not say hello to Mrs. Rasky. One does not say hello to the sculptural head of Nefertiti in a museum. By some inexplicable alchemy of the centuries, Leah Rasky's darkly luminous slanting eyes, her high cheekbones curving down to her delicate, sensuous mouth, the carriage, the manner, all might have been copied complete from ancient Egyptian royalty. Untutored in the lore of royalty, ancient Egyptian or otherwise, Mrs. Rasky was totally unaware of this resemblance. Amidst the cheese, the canned goods, the housewares, Mrs. Rasky was wearing a short, boxy, lemon yellow jacket with a small standing collar. It was cut with reticent elegance like a Chinese woman's coat. So despite the fact that they're guests in Mrs. Rathsky's home, she does not speak once. She represents an ancient Aboriginal past that would be at home in a museum, but does not belong amongst the modern contraptions the audience finds her with. She is orientalized by comparisons to China and Egypt. So Ferber is using her to make the argument that this native relic belongs literally anywhere else in the world other than where we find her. According to Ferber, the native population will soon be gone. Thor says of modern food and culture in the Arctic, it may kill them off in time. Maybe that's what we want unconsciously. Thor uses blood quantum politics to imagine indigenous elimination. Paradoxically, indigenous blood becomes too weak to maintain true indigeneity, just as it becomes powerful enough to construct settler society. He writes, or in the book it says, the Eskimos are dying off, of course, killed by civilization. Yes, the breed survived pretty well. That mixture of Eskimo and Scandinavian stock, or Russian stock, or German, or English, or American, that is pretty sturdy stuff. Like me, like you, my child. Soon there won't be an actual Eskimo left. So Thor describes first the way that diluting indigenous blood will soon eliminate the native. He then explains the way that incorporating indigenous blood through native mothers and settler fathers creates a settler society. It ought to make a pretty good specimen of American. Their children will be 1/4 Eskimo, their children's children 1/8. First thing you know, we'll have an Eskimo strain president of the United States. And when I was writing this originally was when Warren was in the running for the Democratic nomination and the whole Pocahontas exchange between her and Trump was going on. So the conversation that Thor has with Christine here helps to illuminate the confusing way that Ferber wishes the audience to view Christine as both a native daughter and native mother. In Orgruck, Christine attends a native dance, and as she watches, was startled by the curiously protective maternal feeling that surged through her as she looked at the merry upturned face, the laughing eyes. Christine is feeling maternal towards Alaska natives that are much older than her. And after watching the dancing for a while, to Birdie's horror and to her own surprise, Chris too stepped forward and joined the dancers. She kept her eyes on the dancer just in front of her. She raised her arms thus, she turned her head thus, she shifted her foot this way, that way, and she too was almost indistinguishable among the shifting dancers. The Alaska natives that are in Orgruck are aboriginalized and treated as relics and tourist attractions, while Christine is further indigenized by her ability to dance indistinguishably from the people there. There's a third subset of the population that Ferber must organize into the settler society through ethnification. The Asian cannery workers that come to Alaska are described in a highly racialized way. And these racial minorities are clearly labeled as outsiders. And Christine does not think that they belong here. She says, hundreds of thousands of outsiders working and getting wages and taking the money. Absurdly, she threatened, I'm going to tell my grandfather. The threat to tattle to her grandfather, as absurd as it is, relays important information about the criminal nature of ethnic minorities extracting wages from Alaska in Christine's mind. After the tense conversation, her guide vanishes, but Juan Pico too vanished. All the Suwak cannery employers, like gens in mythology, seem to have miraculous vanishing powers. One moment they stood before you, smiling, polite, even deferential. You asked a question, they vanished. So the three references to vanishing in this passage further reinforces the tenuousness of place that ethnified minorities exist in Alaska, even as their deferential manners clearly place them lower in the settler society hierarchy. Okay, so, sorry, I forgot to switch slides. This is a poster from the movie that kind of portrays Christine's autochthonous birth. You see the dead caribou there and the furs. And that looks like it must be her mother. Okay. So Christine claims her indigenous heritage through her grandmother. Vine Deloria in his book, Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto, calls Indian heritage through the grandmother America's Indian grandmother complex. Christine describes her indigenous ancestry this way. My grandmother on my father's side was 1/4 Eskimo, so my father was 1/8 Eskimo. That makes me 1/16. Ferber is careful to draw Christine's lineage through her grandmother instead of her equally legitimate Eskimo father. She also gives Christine European royal ancestry through Thor Storm, who reveals halfway through the novel that he ran away from Scandinavian royal court and its subsequent duties and expectations. Tsar Kennedy is especially interested in what this means for Christine. You're probably some kind of countess or something. Your children would be sprung from nobility. These dual lineages further support the creation of Christine as the perfect ancestor for the new settler society. Rena Green posits that the settler identity anxieties resurrect America's Pocahontas perplex. With her darker, negatively viewed sister, the squaw, or the anti-Pocahontas, the princess intrudes on the national consciousness, and a potential cult waits to be resurrected when our anxieties about who we are make us recall her from her woodland retreat. The Indian squaw and the Indian princess are both defined by their relationships to white settlers and white settler heteropatriarchy. Christine gets her lineage from an Indian squaw and then becomes ennobled by Thor's royal lineage, creating an Indian princess with founding powers that gives credibility to both Thor and Tsar through kinship. So this is Christine's grandmother and Thor Storm. There are two-part native love interests in Christine in the Ice Palace, Christine and her grandmother. Though the Pocahontas perplex as outlined by Green, their respective treatment becomes clear. The sexuality of the grandmother has been realized and she is no longer useful and has been discarded. Of Thor's relationship with Christine's grandmother, the town of Baranoff says, "He married one of those half-breed Eskimo girls, but he isn't as big a fool as that. I mean, he's kind of crazy, but no fool. Any Eskimo will lend you his wife. Anybody knows that if that's what you want." The promised but never realized sexual potential of Christine allows her to maintain her power as symbol for the new civilization. Chris Storm gets to hold this place because she is not a squaw. Identity is created against an other, and Christine's Indian princess identity is built against the many references to squaw throughout the novel. However, the princess and the squaw are both defined by their relationship to white men. If he desires her, then she is a princess. If he has her, then she is a squaw. Storm maintains the founding power of the Indian princess precisely because she is not married in the end of the novel. Ice Palace conflates Alaska with the body of Christine Storm, incorporates that body into the heteropatriarchal settler colonialism, and thus imaginatively, figuratively, brings Alaska into the white Western social order. The timely ending of the Ice Palace that leaves Christine yet unmarried, but with two clear romantic paths forward, can be explained by further examining Pocahontas in Philip Young's article, Pocahontas, the Mother of Us All. Young explores the disturbing elements of the Pocahontas story, that she never marries John Smith. Yet there must be something obscurely right about an apparently unsatisfactory ending, or over the many centuries, we would have succeeded in changing it. Likewise, the Ice Palace ends without Christine Storm married to either Ross or Bay, which are the two love interests in the novel. The Pocahontas perplex articulates why Ferber would have made this choice. To fulfill the sexual promise of marriage, the Indian princess becomes the Indian squaw in a way that would rob Christine of her founding powers. Yet the plot movement of the novel is to incorporate Christine into the heteropatriarchal order of settler colonialism. Her transference from Thor and Tsar, her grandfathers, is complete upon their death, and the two love interests mean that her only path forward is to either marry Ross or Bay. These two suitors represent a clear path forward, and the novel's timely ending means that the audience can simultaneously hold Christine in a fixed yet contradictory place, successfully incorporated into the heteropatriarchal settler colonialism, but also a virginal Indian princess vested with founding powers forever. Once again, the princess comforts white men, and while she promises much, she remains aloof. Her sexuality can be hinted at, but never realized. So in conclusion, Ice Palace begins in a place of anxiety. Christine interrogates incoming tourists in this manner. She says, "We're a territory. Everything we do and everything the territory yields goes out. Outside, everything goes out and nothing stays in. Gold, copper, timber, fish, millions and millions a year. Outside, we're slaves." So statehood resolves the question of whether settlers are pioneers or slaves. Tsar and Thor's death at the end of the novel mark their resolution. The project of assimilation is complete through Christine. The arc of the story closely mirrors the anxiety and resolution of the time. With indigenous land claims unresolved and statehood's imminent arrival, Ice Palace seeks to outline exactly what the active statehood achieves in terms of white settler identity construction. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, like I said previously, what we'll do is we'll wait until the end for the questions and answer period. I'm wondering what the status of Philip Wight's presentation is. Is Phil ready to go?
Can you guys hear me?
All right. Well, I'd already introduced you, Philip. So why don't you just
Yeah.
push on with your presentation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tom.
Okay.
All right. Can you guys see that and hear me?
Yep.
Thanks, yeah.
All right. I hope so. In late March 2020, amid the COVID-19 pandemic, the Alaska Industrial Development and Export Authority convened an emergency meeting to allocate funds for the controversial Ambler Road. ADA argued the funds would spur the development of a 200-mile industrial road and create jobs that summer. Dozens of Alaskans called in to the meeting to protest the road funding on the agenda. ADA had little experience conducting meetings telephonically, and the results were comically chaotic. Speakers talked over each other incessantly. ADA officials had totally lost control of the meeting. Angry Alaskans accused the board of taking advantage of a health emergency to bypass normal public process. Public comments were overwhelmingly hostile. The upshot was clear. A vocal group of Alaskans were militantly opposed to the construction of a new Arctic road. The Ambler proposal was but one in a long line of proposed road projects that have been contested over the past 50 years of Alaska's history. The proposals are almost too numerous to fully list, but they include the Pebble Mine Export Road, the Eisenbeck National Wildlife Refuge Road, the Copper River Highway, and the Cordova Port Road. This begs a pressing historical question. When and why did many Alaskans begin to question the merits of new road infrastructure? How do we arrive at our present reality when virtually every new road project is opposed by a vocal group of Alaskans? So I'd like to offer a series of arguments on this subject. Access and a lack of access have long defined Alaska. Transportation routes and infrastructures have been key to developing Alaska resources and sustaining Alaskans' ability to live a quote unquote modern American way of life, end quote. At the same time, lack of access has helped to preserve large swaths of Alaska from development. Lack of access has also been important not only for wilderness preservation, but also for maintaining traditional lifeways and the sovereignty of Alaska Natives. Ultimately, a road is never just a road. It is a product of political economy. It is a cultural construction and a social symbol. In Alaska, roads have evolved from symbols of progress, modernity, and development to symbols of exploitation, extraction, and despoilment for many residents. Transportation has long been critical for opening access to development, but a countervailing force emerged in strength in the 1960s and 1970s. Alaskans en masse began to see roads and their consequences as antithetical to many of the values they held dear. There have been degrees of contestation about roads. Even those who support or supported new roads have favored limiting access and keeping some roads primitive. So let's start with some early anti-road sentiment in the state. Road construction, symbolized modernity, development, and prosperity for settler colonial Alaskans from, roughly the 1860s through the 1940s. The Richardson, Glen, and Alcan highways were celebrated as ribbons of progress through the morass of wilderness. But the situation began to slowly change in the late 1950s. One of the earliest signs of the coming anti-roads activism centered around the creation of an important conservation space in northeastern Arctic Alaska. Concern over future roads played an important role in conservationist plans for the future of an Arctic wildlife range. And the origins of many of these road concerns stem from the national experience in the 1930s. During the Great Depression, the impulse to create maximum accessibility and the cheap labor of the Civilian Conservation Corps resulted in the large-scale proliferation of highways leading to and through the nation's national parks. As historian Paul Sutter has demonstrated, The Wilderness Society had its roots in opposing new road construction throughout the nation's wild public places. In the affluent post-war era, Americans swarmed the national parks in their automobiles, leading to traffic jams and a condition that writer Edward Abbey called industrial tourism. Thus, in the 1950s, conservationists favored protecting northeastern Alaska as a wilderness and primitive area devoid of any future road or automobiles. At the Sierra Club's 1957 Biennial Wilderness Conference in San Francisco, a quote unquote momentous gathering of Arctic proponents reached a consensus, quote, that wildlife range status would be best, simplest, and least controversial, end quote. Conservation leaders still wanted the area to be a park-like thing that encouraged recreation without roads and congestion that characterized the post-war parks of the lower 48. They did not want the Arctic Range to become another Yellowstone traffic jam. Thus, when Secretary of the Interior Fred Seaton and President Eisenhower protected northeastern Alaska in 1960, it was a wildlife range, not a national park. In the 1960s, the environment of Alaska itself also impeded greater road development. Prior to 1964, the Alaskan Department of Transportation had a very ambitious plan for new road construction throughout the state. But then the 1964 earthquake stopped new road construction and redirected limited resources towards repair, restoration, and maintenance. The earthquake also almost completely destroyed the work that had been done on the Copper River Highway to connect Chitna to Cordova. A.W. Balvin, a department geologist, concluded that due to the damage the road sustained, it was not possible to repair. And so this marked one of the endpoints in the Alaskan DOT's efforts to build the road to Cordova. The environmental agency of the earthquake worked in tandem with an emerging national sentiment, especially by thought leaders in the conservation movement, that emphasized the problems of ever more roads crisscrossing new wild areas. In his writings about Alaska, Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas wrote in 1967 that not only should no more virgin forests be cut in the state, but also that no more roads should be built, in his opinion. Americans and Alaskans came not only to oppose new Alaskan roads, they came to oppose improving existing roads and facilitating greater access in certain areas. And so the most famous example of this is in Denali National Park and the Mission 66 project by the Park Service, which called for widening and paving the Denali Park Road. Conservation groups felt that the upgrades would change the character of the park experience. And Olaus Murie wrote in December 1959, quote, "The national park will not serve its purpose if we encourage the visitor to hurry as fast as possible for a mere glimpse of scenery from a car and a few snapshots. Rather, there is an obligation inherent in a national park to help the visitor get some understanding, the aesthetic meaning of what is in the place," end quote. So thanks to Murie and others, the Mission 66 proposal for Denali did not go forward, and paving was curtailed beyond Savage River. And I think it's important to discuss the national context that's happening here, because even though it's quite different than Alaska, it comes to characterize some important developments in Alaska. In the 1960s, there was a robust and sustained highway revolt happening throughout the United States. With unprecedented expenditures on the national highway system came an upswell of resistance from local community leaders who saw their neighborhoods being demolished. Highways attracted sharp racial attention and were derided as, quote, "white man's roads through black man's homes," end quote. By 1967, One brief US Department of Transportation survey recorded 123 separate highway protests throughout the United States. While the politics of this highway revolt were quite different from anti-roads protests in Alaska, they shared a similar cultural zeitgeist. Many Americans were now questioning the benefits of progress, that roads, pipelines, dams, and other modern infrastructures rot. Both dealt with land use planning and who benefited from the construction of these access ways. And ethnic concerns were absolutely present in Alaska, where the politics of Euro-American developers blazing roads through ancestral Alaska Native lands became an increasing concern. Then, in 1968, Alaska became front page news throughout the nation. The question of transportation, both for hydrocarbons as well as men and material, became a pressing concern. This led to a turning point in the politics of road construction in Alaska. Facing pressure from the trucking industry and the city of Fairbanks, in the fall of 1968, Governor Wally Hickel requested the state's Department of Transportation develop plans for a winter trail between Livengood and the North Slope. The state wanted a road built faster and cheaper than private industry could provide, so the government directed Alaska's Department of Highways to take control of the project. Rather than taking the time required to construct a proper winter road, which required building up layers of snow and ice to protect the permafrost from disruption, the Department of Highways' huge D9 bulldozers scraped away the tundra and its sensitive top layer of permafrost. When the permafrost thawed that spring, the $700,000 road became a watery ditch that earned the ignominious nickname the Hickel Canal, or the Hickel Canoe Trail, if you will. It was an impassable, uneconomic, ugly scar that reflected the haste and hubris of the state. Quote, the road wanders here and there, and quote, Arctic resident Bud Helmerich explained, quote, often making several false starts as if it had been laid out by teenage surveyors starting from different directions, end quote. Not only was the Hickel Highway ecologically destructive, it only facilitated the movement of a mere 8 tons that winter, less than 3 C-130 flights from Fairbanks to the North Slope. As one University of Alaska professor called the road, quote, the biggest screw up in the history of mankind in the Arctic. So, you know, the state of Alaska created precisely the kind of ecological disaster that the pipeline owner companies wished to avoid. It attracted national outrage and elevated the Alaska pipeline controversy. After the Hickel Highway fiasco, Alaska's road politics would never be the same. Not long after, in direct relation to incidents like the Santa Barbara oil spill and concerns over the future of Alaskan oil development, or Alaskan development writ large, Congress passed the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. Now Alaskan road builders had to plan and integrate a variety of environmental considerations. Projects became more intricate and time-consuming. Furthermore, with the passage of ANCSA in 1971, the newly outlined Alaska Native land holdings added a level of complexity and uncertainty to future road development projects. As the Alaska pipeline controversy came to a head in 1973, some newly formed Alaska Native corporations expressed their hostility to new roads through their ancestral lands. In a July 1973 letter, Doi Unlimited explained that its 41 villages in interior Alaska were, quote, opposed to the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline and the construction of all road systems west and north of Fairbanks that would connect our villages with urban centers, end quote. The North Slope Borough would also soon come out against any public use of the newly approved haul road. As a result, the Alaska Department of Transportation needed additional time to prepare plans and assess impacts. An ambitious strategic plan for the state's road corridors that was under discussion in the early 1970s was tabled indefinitely due to the complex new land ownership patterns, rights of way, funding, and access concerns. And this leads us to Jay Hammond. Skepticism about new road development reached its institutional apex during the governorship of J. Hammond. Hammond campaigned on quote unquote healthy growth and ensuring Alaska's quality of life. He was elected at a moment when the intensity and social disruption of the pipeline construction dominated the state. As an avowed conservationist, Hammond believed that the current generation of Alaskans, those of political age in the 1970s, would either fulfill or foreclose visions for a sustainable state. Alaskans had to choose between, quote, whether our money feeds an unhealthy, cancerous growth in Alaska or sustains a more reasonably healthy, smaller scale economy, end quote. When it came to roads and transportation, Hammond explicitly rebuked the frontier worldview that had long characterized the position of the state's leaders. Quote, Alaskans are no longer in full accord that roads should be built to tie us all together, Hammond concluded. He railed against former road projects which he saw as unwise and ecologically destructive. Quote, no more Hickle highways, unwanted $100 million roads to Bristol Bay, crumbling Egan drives or Tudor roads will be built in this administration, he proclaimed. Hammond's critical view towards roads was most evident in his policy towards the Haul Road. The governor surprised many when he advocated abandoning the Haul Road soon after the construction of TAPS. Instead, he wanted a railroad on top of the Haul Road, which he believed would open up areas for mineral extraction, but leave wilderness areas and indigenous communities untouched. Hammond agreed with famous environmentalist David Brower, who argued that, quote, you don't have a lot of things happening alongside a railroad that happens alongside a road, end quote. Hammond argued that Haul Road policy was really about what to do with the northern half of the state. He believed the opening of the Haul Road to the public might ultimately have a bigger long-term impact than the Trans-Alaska Pipeline system itself. The road, he argued, will have, quote, profound effects on the future of our state. Once opened, we would never likely be able to modify that access, end quote. And despite the Alaska Pipeline Service Company's transfer of the Haul Road as a gift to the state, Hammond worried about the long-term costs of maintaining such a vast infrastructure. Indeed, some of today's road politics confirm Hammond's concerns. The high costs of maintaining and building roads in the north have limited budgets for new roads and convinced some Alaskans that new roads are more of a costly burden than a driving economic force. And we can see this today with the Haul Road itself. Today, more of the Haul Road is being stripped of pavement than is being paved. This is a program that the state calls strategic disinvestment. It is far more costly to maintain the paved road of the Haul Road than it is to maintain the unpaved nature of that infrastructure. In conclusion, one thing is clear. J. Hammond's contention that Alaskans no longer believe roads should crisscross the state is as true today as ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Well, now it's time for questions and answers from the presenters. Do we have, we might as well open that up to people that want to ask some questions, if there are any. I see some in the chat box here. I see several possibilities there. Is Karen?
Yeah, those had to do with the audio and problems. I don't see any questions. Do you?
I don't either.
If anybody in the audience, you just click the raise your hand feature and we can allow you to talk, or you can type in a question, or maybe the panelists have questions for each other.
Yeah.
Okay, now I see. Okay.
I have a question to Leanna Williams, who exactly, I forgot, you probably said it, but who found Eielson? Was it a Russian group that actually found the body of him and his co-pilot?
It was Joe Crossan and Harold Gillum. They were flying separate planes, and so it was the day after the sun came back up over the horizon. They saw a glint of metal, if I remember correctly.
All right, I knew that there were Russian aviators also looking for them at the time.
Absolutely, and the Russian aviators actually did a lot of the recovery efforts and excavation. So
okay. All right, that was one question I had.
You're right. There is a question in the chat from Carol Gales. Leanna, do you see that?
I do. Yes, I see that.
I'm reading it out loud because the attendees can't see it.
Sure. The question is, did the coverage of airplane accidents talk about poor choices or risk by pilots, or did they never go there? So they talked about risk, but it usually wasn't presented in a negative light. It was just accepted as a needed element of the job. And did they talk about poor choices? Generally not. Everything, and I'm generalizing here. The tendency was to frame these poor choices as, either, just I lost my train of thought there, and I'll say that they just generally didn't talk about the poor choices. That was something that didn't really develop in the discussion about aviation, at least what made it into the newspapers until the late 30s or early 40s as the industry was becoming more professionalized.
Any other questions?
I've got a question. This is Rachel Mason. This is for Philip, I think. You only talked about the anti-road movement up to 1980, but I'm wondering about how that mentality of anti-road played into the subsistence management later, because I remember that places on the road system were usually considered non-rural, so it was kind of a badge of not being real Alaskan if you were on the road system. So I wonder if you could comment on that, and it actually it falls into some of what the other papers were talking about too, is the mentality of the frontier and so forth, whether there was, just you don't want to be on the road system.
Sure. Sorry, Rachel, I cut out. Can you just repeat the beginning of your question again?
Oh, okay. I was wondering how this, how the anti-road mentality fit into the beginnings of subsistence management in Alaska.
Yeah, that is a great question. And part of my research, I've just started this as a new project, kind of thinking about a holistic history of Alaska roads. And anytime you deal with subsistence management, it is just such a massive question. And so I'm not sure that I have a good answer for you or good insights, but it's certainly clear to me in my research, up until the reason I end around 1980 is because 1982 is the end of Jay Hammond's governorship. And I think he really epitomizes the institutional apex of a lot of this thinking. But, those controversies really continue through the 1980s. And, I think the upshot for me is that those subsistence politics are incredibly complicated. And, when it comes to road politics and road management, those controversies are still alive and well with us today. So I need to do more research into that.
Thank you.
There's a question in the chat from Tom Kazaya to Philip. Was there a serious commitment made to keep the Haul Road closed to public access? What happened to that promise?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tom, and something that I've studied a little bit just in my focus on TAPS. I was originally going to do a whole chapter on Haul Road politics and ended up not doing that in the dissertation. And Hammond tried really hard to limit access. Part of the problem came down to federal funding, right? And there was a whole series of litigation on this in the 90s with some conservation groups. And basically, from what I understand, my limited understanding is that because the Haul Road received federal funding, the state was not allowed to limit access in the ways that it wanted to, both the ways that Hammond wanted to, and then into the 90s. And so I forget the exact date that it was fully opened up, whether it was 90, 94, 98, something like that. But, to my mind, it's really remarkable that Hammond stands as this figure who was standing up and saying, like, it is good for the long-term health of our communities to restrict access to these places, right? And I have not studied, Kennecott much, but I would imagine that there's some really instructive parallels with that as well. But you know a lot more about that than I do.
I gave permission for Rebecca to speak next. She had her hand raised. I don't know if you have a microphone, Rebecca. So there's also a, waiting for Rebecca, there's a question in the chat to Tia from Ray Hudson. What contemporary novels set in Alaska would you recommend?
The first book that I would recommend that everybody read is set in the Arctic, and it's just right across kind of the arbitrary border between Alaska and Canada. But it's Split Tooth by Tanya Tekuk. That's a really amazing, cool book. And then I also want to take the opportunity to answer Anuli Grantham, who asks about other Alaska Native women in history. And she asked specifically about Anna, the wife of Alexander Baranoff. And I guess how I would respond to that is just that I find that portrayals from the perspective of Alaska Native women in history don't really exist. So I think it would be very interesting to imagine authentically from their perspective, but there aren't really firsthand accounts of women like Anna, but I think that would be really cool. And then William Snyder asks about identity as Alaskans and how the environment provides a setting for the emergence of the points that you all have asked, and how do we see that these forces operating today. And I guess from my perspective, I would say that the work that I'm trying to do examines the way that settler colonial processes happen in imaginary spaces before they happen in physical and political spaces. And I think today, when we're thinking about decolonization, that we can give credit to the power of decolonizing imagination, decolonizing our minds before we see that decolonization happening in physical and political structures in our society.
I don't know, does anybody else want to take a stab at that question from Bill about identity and the environment? How it relates to what you talked about?
I think it's a fantastic question, but I would have to ponder that one for a while before I could come up with a coherent and substantive answer.
Looks like the chat box is really filled up here.
Yeah, also Ron Inouye has a out loud question, so go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, I want to say how interesting all of the papers have been this afternoon. They take us into totally different worlds, and it's wonderful to be exposed to all of them. I will have a question for Shana, particularly since she's had this long-term fascination with that part of the world, Kenai. How long have you been researching? And I noticed the very obscure sources for your paper. How did you discover them? And have you thought about writing a nice reality TV sketch on Fort Kenai?
Oh, Ron, you're really putting me on the spot. Well, when I moved to Alaska in 1981, I moved to Homer, and I wanted to know about this new place, new life. And I ended up getting a job at the public library. And so I started kind of scanning the shelves to see what I could find out about the area to read. And I was shocked that there wasn't really very much. And what I did find was that the most interesting material was often extremely obscure. For example, the best book I found about Kenai Peninsula history was the proceedings of the 1974 history conference held at Kenai Central High School and typed up by the high school typing class and photocopied. And anyway, so I just really got sort of sucked into being completely fascinated by this place and sort of by extension, Alaska. They talk about it being a physical frontier and an economic frontier, and it's certainly a wide open frontier for anybody who wants to do history or write about things. And as far as the obscurity of the sources, I didn't get a chance to dwell much on my very last slide, which was just sort of a very brief list of sources. But I have to give credit on the Fort Kenai story to a couple of really important sources. And one is a fellow named Steve Lloyd, and I don't know a huge amount about his background, but he was a marine archaeologist, and he's since retired and moved to the lower 48. But he was the one who rediscovered the wreck of the Torrent and did a huge project about it and made a wonderful documentary about that, which was apparently shown at a meeting of the Alaska Historical Society before I joined the group. And I was able to get a copy of that documentary later, and it's just full of references to a lot of the sources that I used. And so that was a huge help. And then the thing that's come available since that time is the papers of Madoram Crawford Jr. And I don't know the exact date, but it was fairly recently that those were put into the archives at UAF and have become available for scholars to access. And I went down there last year and actually took digital pictures of all the stuff and transcribed it. And as far as I know, I don't think anybody has published anything based on what's in it, but I was just blown away by like that anecdote about meeting the natives on the beach after the shipwreck and some of the wild stories about dealing with the drunken Italian lieutenant. And I thought, oh my God, these are such juicy stories. I can't believe nobody's shared them. So I don't know if that partially answers your question, but anyway, I have this great dream that someday I'm going to sit down and get to write a book about the history of the Kenai Peninsula and put all these crazy stories in there and tie them together into something coherent, maybe. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
And there's a question in the chat to Philip from Eric Johnson. I know in the early 1970s, the environmental movement was still very strong. Did you come across protests or pushback against construction of the George Parks Highway between Fairbanks and Anchorage?
Yeah, it's a great question, Eric. And, I have not, looking through some of the Alaska Conservation Society's documents, I wouldn't be surprised if you found a little bit there. I mean, I know that it was not a robust protest, but it, just kind of pivoting closer to the present, it is fascinating to think about that. Even in the early 2000s, when they wanted to pave the Denali Highway, there was a lot of protests from locals along that highway, and they said, no, we don't want the increased traffic. We don't want people driving faster. Leave it gravel. And so, it's a politics of not only just contesting new roads, but limiting the improvement of some infrastructures, which I think probably strikes some of us as, it's wild based on the condition of some of our paved roads.
I'm just going to read out, Rachel Myron wrote a comment and Tia answered it, but I'm going to just read it out loud so the attendees can see it, because it's only between the, so that's okay with Rachel and Tia.
Yeah, it's fine, and I'd be happy to talk about it too.
Okay, so Rachel asked, Tia's talk has really provoked me to think about the role of Alaskana media, books and movies in the American mythos. And she thanks Tia for her talk and that it provokes authentic conversation. And so Tia, you want to go ahead and do what you wrote back?
Yeah, so I responded back to Rachel just talking about how Alaskan settler colonial past is so much more recent than in the continental US and in other settler colonial societies, that we find a lot of indigenous elimination narratives and settler colonial fantasies that show up in contemporary works. And we don't necessarily analyze them in the same critical way that we might look at something like The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper, even though we have similar tropes and narratives that show up in works such as The Snow Child, which garnered a Pulitzer nomination, The Raven's Gift, or Ordinary Wolves.
And then Rachel did respond back that this is such great insight, Tia. I think we will all benefit by thinking about this underlying quote unquote tone as we read. It's important. And then Eric says, interesting about the Denali Highway. Okay. That's what's in the chat. And anybody else have any other questions they either want to type or raise their hand for? I got confused. Rebecca, you had your hand raised and I wasn't getting any audio from you. So I don't know if you had something to say.
Okay. If there's nothing else, I was very impressed with all these presentations. They were wide open. They were very vastly different from each other. I want to thank Shana and Leanna and Philip and Tia for presenting today. And if there's any, I'm sure that there's ways we can get a hold of any one of you if we want to. I could talk forever about highways. I grew up here. I remember when the George Parks Highway was built. It was built in segments, by the way, and and there was different reasons for the different parts of it. But we'll talk about it. It'd take too long to go through that. But anyways, thank you very much. Tom, a bit over time, but I think it was worth having the extra comments and all that. So
there is another question from Angeli Grantham.
Okay.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask Tia if you have some recommendations in addition to novels, but more indigenous thinkers and others that can help us to kind of decolonize our work and how we're viewing Alaska history and some of this Alaskana that Rachel mentioned.
Thank you so much for that question. I really wish that I'd come more prepared for a question like that. A lot of the work that I'm doing in my present research is taking work that thinkers have done in settler states in other areas and kind of importing it into the Arctic, because I did find that when I started this research that there was that was missing. And I do think that given our landscape and kind of the different timelines for colonization in the Arctic, that it does merit a closer look at how those frameworks import to Alaska and also to the Canadian Arctic specifically. I would recommend reading Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and Wang as like a really good academic article. But then there are some other novels that I'd say are really good by contemporary Indigenous authors, such as The Marrow Thieves by Seirdwyn Dovey, or They're There by Tommy Orange, or The Night Watchman by Louise Erdwich.
Thank you.
And it looks like there's one other question by Rebecca Paulson in the chat. And I guess she says, has this kind of looking at settler colonialist ideology expressed in a work of fiction in relation to society at the time, has anyone looked at contemporary writing, especially nature writing, for the indigenizing versus aboriginalizing, and how that relates to social situation now? And I'll just respond by saying that I'm trying to do that research now. But I haven't found anybody else who's doing that very specifically for Alaska.
Okay. I think that covers it. I'm just going to make the announcement that hope you can join us tomorrow, and that some of the people who keep struggling to get online, you get them online by tomorrow. Tomorrow at 10 is a session on the 1918 influenza epidemic, so we hope you can join us. And then at 2 o'clock is the annual business meeting that we hope everybody can join in on, and that is not part of this Zoom webinar. It's actually a Zoom meeting, and you should have all received a separate invite from Joe and the members at alaskahistoricalsociety.org email, which would have the Zoom link and password in. If you have not received that and you want to participate in the business meeting, which includes selection results, awards, memorials, kind of a annual report from the board, and we may be hearing some reports from local historical societies on their efforts in the last year. This email members at alaskahistoricalsociety.org, and Joe will send you the link information to that. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tom, for moderating.
Thank you. Thank you for being the IT person. You have been absolutely invaluable for the whole project.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.